I have the privilege this morning to introduce a dear, dear friend, Maria Alejandra Andrade Vinueza. I have known forever. Native to Ecuador. She lived for many years in Costa Rica, where we actually met. She lives in Ecuador with her husband, Frank, and her 2 children. And you can read the formalities of her bio on the ASM website and the HUVA. What you can't read about is the fact that she is just a committed engager with people, bridging, bringing, listening, bridging between people, listening to them, conveying, I would say even she's a cultural interpreter to other people from one place to another, because the experience she's had through her work for many years with World Vision and now with Tear Fund as a lead of one of the teams just has given her the opportunity to be in many different contexts. And another notable thing that's not in the written bio is the fact that she's part of a movement within Latin America called Indigenous Memory, Memoria Indígena, that is working to affirm the value of the history of the spirituality of the indigenous people groups across our continent, and how they can also affirm their faith as Christians and dialogue and integrate their identity as indigenous people with their Christian faith. So please join me in welcoming Maria Alejandra Andrade.
Buenos días. My screen just disappeared. Wait, just a second. Technology doesn't always help. Yes. So thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you, Sean, and thank you, everyone, for this invitation. It's very special, and it means a lot to me to be with you. I am really happy to share this space, some reflections around identity, culture, and mission as we embark on this journey to keep reflecting from the rest to the West, as Ruth mentioned yesterday, and what it reveals about power, justice, and also the possibilities of a truly mutual gospel witness. I want to speak from who I am. I am, as Ruth said, from Ecuador. I am a mestiza woman, which means a mixed race. My blood carries the memory of a very profound clash. It was not a love encounter, as I have heard some people saying lately, between the indigenous people of Abya Yala. Abya Yala is a way of referring to the to the American continent in a way that recalls the existence before the arrival of the conquerors. So by 500 years ago, these conquerors believed that they were conquering a land that merely happened to be inhabited, which of course was not true. So in my identity, I hold 2 things. I hold hope, and I also hold sorrow, and the history of a gospel that is spread within shadows as well. My existence is a living trace of a colonial history that, despite political independence, is actually not over. Even our language carries traces of coloniality. The fact that I speak Spanish, and I can speak English, and I can even speak French, but I don't speak Quechua, my mother tongue, the language of my ancestors, reveals how deep that history runs. But also the fact that we commonly call people from the US Americans unintentionally makes an entire continent disappear. America is a continent. I am American as well, because words matter, terminology matter, because it carries an ideology and ultimately also shapes history. So all these things make us believe that colonialism somehow still lives in our memory, in our culture, in our systems, and whether we like it or not, and whether it is painful, it also lives in our faith. So I also speak as a mother of 2 boys, as Ruth said. And why am I speaking about this? Because raising them in a world that feels increasingly disoriented, where the values are upside down and the name of God is used so many times to justify so much violence, actually there are some questions that are not only intellectual, they become urgent. It's not about what I think or what I believe. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's about how the next generation will encounter God. And when I think about this, I am more and more convinced that memory, identity, and culture are essential for navigating this moment. So let me begin by remembering, and let me also engage with you in the way our ancestors used to do, through stories. So I want to use three moments of our history in Latin America using 3 images. The image of the seed, and I am very thankful about the song this morning. I have a seed here, very small. And there are some seeds behind if you want to grab some at any point. The seed, the soil, and the pot. So let's begin with the chapter 1 of my story. Let's go back 500 years ago. That day, dawn was very different. The sea, which had always been generous, carried enormous floating houses. From the shore, the children looked in amazement. What kind of birds were those with wide wings that swelled with the wind? In Abya Yala, the encounter with a stranger was a clash of worlds. The newcomers were received with a mixture of curiosity and mistrust. They brought heavy clothes, iron that shone in the sun, and also unknown animals that snorted at night. But the strangest thing was not what they carried in their hands. It was actually what they carried in their eyes. They looked at the land as if it were not alive. They looked at the river as it were not a being. They looked at the forest as if it were not a family. For my ancestors, the mountain was not an object. It was grandmother, Pachamama. The river was not only water, it was life-giving blood. The air was never empty, it was shared breath. Everything was woven together in a sort of cosmic tapestry of life. We knew that we did not own the land, we belonged to it. Soon, curiosity turned into fear. The newcomers spoke of a distant, jealous, powerful God, a God who was not found in the river, not in the tree, not in the flight of the birds, a God who demanded obedience, not relationship, submission, not reciprocity. They declare our ways dark, our spirituality idolatrous. In my land, the seed of the gospel entered, wrapped in words of salvation, but accompanied by swords and chains. Our great-great-great-grandfathers and great-great-great-grandmothers did not experience the cross as good news, but as violence. The wealth of our lands unleashed greed. Gold and silver were extracted and shipped to the old continent. The bodies of our men and women were subjected to forced labor and sexual abuse. The forests were destroyed. Entire systems of life were broken. In less than a century, more than 80% of the original population in Abya Yala, so from 60 million to 12 million, disappeared in the first 100 years because of wars, slavery, and diseases brought from Europe. But it was not only people that died. Ways of relating died as well. Languages died. Worlds died. And while dispossession was suffered in the villages, the Spanish crown used the Bible to legitimize the barbarity. So in 1550, in Valladolid, theologians and jurists met to resolve a question that today seems unthinkable. Were the indigenous peoples of Abya Yala fully human? Are they fully human? So theologian Sepúlveda found in the Bible arguments to justify violence. So he took some passages from the Old Testament where Israel defeats idolatrous people. He defended the divine right to subdue by force those who worshipped other gods. He also leaned on Aristotle, but then he reinforced his argument with a distorted interpretation of texts such as the Great Banquet in Luke 14. Compel them to come, to say that faith must fill the house, even by sword. For Sepúlveda, indigenous peoples were barbarians who worshipped the sun and practiced human sacrifice. And for such people, conquest was actually an act of charity because it was cleaning their souls by force, but cleaned. Facing him, Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas appealed to the same scripture, but with different eyes and, of course, with a different heart. Among other things, he argued that all human beings bear the imago Dei, and therefore they could not be treated as inferior beings. He recalled that Jesus' principal commandment was love to God, to oneself, to other human fellows, and to wide creation, and that loving the neighbors translates into respect for life, for their culture, and for their dignity. De las Casas also affirmed that faith in Jesus could never be imposed by force, so killing in order to convert was sacrilege. So finally, this friar appealed to the undeniable presence of God throughout the whole earth, the earth, like Psalm 24, to affirm that the breath of the Ruah was already blowing in Abya Yala, even before the arrival of the conquerors and the missionaries. As you can imagine, the debate about humanity of the original peoples in Latin America was not resolved in 1550. Actually, the exploitations of peoples and territories at the hands of European colonizers continued until the 20th century, when political independence processes took place. However, the shadow of colonization did not disappear completely with independence. It rather took like a deeper and more persistent form. One form that continues to shape the way societies think, the way in which societies organize themselves, and assign value to human life. There are some decolonial thinkers in Latin America that refer this to coloniality. Not colonization, but coloniality. And they identify 4 areas in which this coloniality system still exerts influence. So they speak about the coloniality of power, the coloniality of knowledge, the coloniality of being, and more lately, even the coloniality of belief. I won't go through this because it will take my whole time, but I encourage you to read a little bit about that, or we can talk as well as we will be here these days. So colonialism to coloniality in a system that shapes in different ways. Coloniality allowed hegemonic Christianity to be shaped according to the interest of a system that was colonial, that was anthropocentric, so centered on the human being, but also that was patriarchal. And I think that this is true, and it's something that as church we need to grapple with, both within the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Church as well. So with this, I close my first chapter, and I want to take us many centuries later and move to the 20th century. And this will be my chapter 2. The next slide, please. Uruguayan theologian Mortimer Arias used the image of the seed and the pot, drawing from D.T. Niles, to describe the relationship between gospel and culture. And I read, "This gospel is like a seed, and that seed must be sown. When the seed of the gospel is sown in Palestine, a plant is born, and we call it Palestine Christianity. But then you sow the gospel in Great Britain, and you get British Christianity. And then you bring the gospel to North America, and then North American Christianity arises. Well, in Latin America, when the missionaries came to our lands, they brought with them not only the seed of the gospel, but their own Christian plant, including the pot. So he says, what we need to do is break the pot, take out the seed of the gospel, plant it in our own cultural soil, and allow our version of Christianity to emerge." He's talking about again, the experience between culture and gospel in Latin America, but I think that it's relevant beyond our lands as well. So let's talk about the plant and the pot. The arrival of evangelical missions in Latin America was part of the worldwide missionary awakening of the early 20th century, especially following Edinburgh 1910. And I was very happy to see yesterday's video, because there was this big event to commemorate, to celebrate Edinburgh, that important moment in 1910. In Latin America, in 1916, took place the Panama Congress. And this brought together representatives of various Protestant denominations with the specific purpose of planning missionary work in Latin American continent. So what resulted from Panama somehow partly explains today's evangelical landscape in Latin America, why there are so many historic churches in the south cone of Latin America, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, but also it explains why Pentecostalism is growing so much in Central America. So if we go back, there was a distribution of who is going where, and it explains where we are today as well, partly. So the impact of these missions was very significant and left a very important legacy in our continent. Schools, hospitals, theological institutions, Bible publishing houses were funded by those missions, and some of them still exist today. So there is a lot to celebrate. These are important, and we need to recognize them. However, despite the good intentions and, of course, the undeniable contribution, that shadow of coloniality, of power, of knowledge, or of being and belief, also still shaped what happened at that moment and the ways in which the gospel, the seed of the gospel, was planted in our land. So let me share some examples. Panama 1916 was important, but it had a very strong leadership from the United States. The strategic cooperation decisions were made by the North Americans and Europeans. And yes, according to historians, there were Latin Americans, but they were formally there as observers. So there are historians like Arturo Piedra that affirm that the Congress was more about Latin America. It was not with Latin America. And somehow, of course, this was reinforcing an ecclesial and cultural dependence with respect to the global north. Latin America was treated as a mission territory, despite its long Christian Catholic tradition, which is a stance that somehow was forgetting and delegitimizing the existing expressions of faith. Foreign ecclesial models were introduced without sufficient engagement with local realities. So, in a way, the North American path shaped how the church in Latin America was formed, how mission was understood, and how God was experienced in Latin America. But of course, this is not the whole story, because over time, local leaders resignified the gospel through Latin American lenses, and this started to emerge more and more, and to open the way for some other ways of expressing the faith that were more contextualized and that were also more critical in the face of social justice. Among them, there were two young men at that time, René Padilla and Samuel Escobar. And actually, part of their influence was also missionaries, incarnational missionaries, like John Mackay. So they became convinced that faith is not meant to be lived on the balcony. Faith is meant to be lived on the road. And these young leaders dared to challenge the pot in a very, very complex history. But in order to understand how disruptive they were, again, we need to go back to history. So let me take you to 1969. 1969 was the middle of the Cold War, and we had two superpowers that were competing for power and ideological influence. The US wanted to contain the spread of communism throughout Latin America, presenting it as an existential threat, a threat to freedom, a threat to democracy, and a threat to the Christian values. But in practice, it meant very concrete things in our countries. It meant interventions at multiple levels through the CIA, financially, strategically, military, but also politically, under what it was called Operación Condor, the Operation Condor. The US supported actively authoritarian regimes that were aligned with their interests, such as Pinochet in Chile, or Videla in Argentina, Pastor Rios Montt in Guatemala, or Somoza in Nicaragua, among many others. All of these guys were accused of crimes against humanity, includes massacres and systematic violations of human rights. The impact of Operación Condor was devastating. During the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, those were decades of ferocious state oppression, leaving hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned, executed, tortured, exiled, and disappeared. We will never know the numbers, but history is claiming for that. So in this context of poverty, violence, and interventionism is that the first Latin American Congress of Evangelization, CLADE 1, for those who have heard, was held in Bogota. That was the context. It was organized by Billy Graham Association, and the Congress focused on a very heavily, focused very heavily on individual conversion and verbal proclamation of the gospel, which was largely disconnected with the realities of the people at that time. In the face of such contradiction, young men like Padilla and Escobar raised a strong and prophetic voice against a very totally disembodied proclamation of the gospel. They said that the gospel could not be proclaimed in Latin America without addressing the lived realities of poverty, inequality, and violence. So this is where the integral mission, the concept of integral mission comes up. Not in a very easy, not in an easy moment, not without disrupting, not without putting people uncomfortable. It was not a romantic moment. It was a very, very difficult situation. And we affirm that evangelization is inseparable from social justice and political responsibility. And this is a quote from Samuel Escobar that also reflected that willingness to play our part. As Latin Americans, it was also time to change the way in which we relate with the gospel and relate with the powers as well. So the impact was immediate. While some conservative sectors considered their proposal a dangerous politicization of the gospel, actually many young Christians experienced CLADE 1 as a turning point. The seed that was planted in Bogota in 1969 gave rise to a movement that reshaped Latin American Protestantism, demonstrating that following Jesus involves both proclaiming salvation but also pursuing justice. With this, I want to take us to my last chapter, and our last chapter is today. Remind us that each generation must write its own history. But doing that requires learning to read our context, because the gospel witness always takes place in a specific time and in a specific place. So if previous generations had to discern the seed of the gospel under the weight of conquest, mission expansion, and dictatorship, our generation faces the challenge of nourishing that seed in what US futurist and researcher James Cassio calls a bunny world. Bunny world is a world that is increasingly brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. So in that bunny world, systems collapse unexpectedly. The fear is shaping societies. Reality feels fragmented and difficult to interpret. What does faith have to say in such a type of world? And in such a type of world, colonial dynamics do not disappear. They actually exacerbate. And faith becomes especially powerful because it can be manipulated to offer false certainties and reinforce systems of oppression, or faith can become a source of discernment, a source of resistance, and a source of hope. So Ruth asserted yesterday that the rest has some gifts for the world. And I do believe that the seed of the gospel that was planted in Abya Yala took root, and it took root amid suffering and resistance, and that seed also grew up, nourished by the community, by resistance and resilience and hope. So today I want to suggest 4 gifts, 4 ways in which living the faith in Latin America can contribute to building our society, our culture, and also our life world. Of course, Latin America is very diverse, and our cultures are very diverse, but I do believe that these 4 fruits, these 4 gifts, are part of many our Latin American communities. So the first one is a faith that bears the weight of reality. Jesuit theologian Ignacio Ellacuría argued that Christian faith requires from us 3 movements. The first movement, hacernos cargo de la realidad, to understand reality. The second movement, cargar con la realidad, which means bear the weight of reality. But the third movement, encargarnos de la realidad. It's commit ourselves to the transformation of reality. So these are not 3 separate actions, but are 3 dimensions of discipleship. So first, we need to learn to see reality truthfully, to recognize the wounds of our time, not deny them, not try to hide them. And we need to learn to name evil by its name. Let's name it. It's called violence. It's called forced migration. It's called ecological collapse. It is called inequality. It is called gender violence. It is called racism. And the many ways in which human life is treated as disposable. So let's name evil. This is hacernos cargo de la realidad. Second, we need to allow ourselves to be affected by that reality. It's not about analyzing suffering. People suffering don't need suffering to be analyzed by others. We need to grieve with those who suffer. And third, we need to act. Faith cannot remain on the balcony. Faith needs to walk in the road. So Scripture is filled with stories that embody these 3 movements, but ultimately we see that in Jesus himself, who entered fully into the reality of our world. He carried its suffering on his own body, and he inaugurated God's work of restoration. So understanding reality is important, but it's never enough. Grieving with those who suffer is necessary, but it's also not enough. And action without understanding or compassionate love is not enough either. Perhaps this is what Latin American theology has been trying to teach to the church all along. Faith begins by seeing reality truthfully. Faith matures by allowing the reality to break our hearts. And faith matures when it becomes complete only when it participates in God's work of restoration. So that's the first fruit. The second fruit, a faith that is embodied in real bodies. Latin American feminist theologians reminded us that theology does not begin in abstraction. Theology begins in real bodies. Theologians like Yvonne Guevara or Elsa Tames say that human beings are not disembodied souls passing through history. We are embodied, we are relational, and we are vulnerable beings. Our bodies carry memory. They bear the marks of oppression and exclusion. And also our bodies reveal how structures of sin operate in the world. The bodies of women, the bodies of migrants, the bodies of indigenous peoples, the bodies of children and racialized communities often becomes where injustice is most visibly inscribed. But these bodies, those same bodies, also are the places where revelation takes place and revelation grows. So let's consider the woman bent over in Luke 13. For 18 years, this woman has been getting the weight of her world written on her body. Her condition was physical, but it was not only physical. Her bent body revealed a deeper reality of broken relationships and oppressive structures. She was living under the empire, within a patriarchal society that marginalized women, and in a social order that burdened the poor and vulnerable. When Jesus restores her, the miracle is neither spiritual only or neither physical. Her body straightens, but the empire remains. The structures that kept people bowed down remain. However, seeing her, calling her, and publicly restoring her dignity, in doing that, Jesus is confronting those forces, and he is also announcing that they will not have the final word. Her straightened body becomes a sign of resistance and a foretaste of God's coming reign, the fruits of a kingdom that are already breaking into history. The gospel is not only about saving souls, it's about people standing up right again and the world beginning to bend toward God's justice. So that's the second fruit. The third fruit is a faith that resists through community. And one of the deepest truths of indigenous peoples in Abya Yala is that we don't only have relationships. They would say that we actually are relationships. So if Descartes declared, I think, therefore I am, for indigenous people in my region, they would say, we relate, therefore we are. In fact, life itself is relational. Nothing exists outside of relation. Nothing exists in isolation, which is why God is also part of that tapestry. The communities across Latin America have survived centuries of hardship through reciprocity, mutual care, solidarity, shared responsibility. We say that in our countries, the social security service doesn't exist. Our family is our social security because government fails, but relationships do not fail. We resist together, we mourn together, and we also celebrate together. This is not foreign to Christianity. At the heart, Christianity proclaims about a relational God, the triune God, whose very being is communion and reconciliation. And this is very important because in a world that prizes individual achievement, a world that rewards independence and normalizes isolation, community actually is an act of resistance. Perhaps this is one of Latin American greatest gifts to a bunny world, because community restores meaning. It offers orientation amid fragmentation, and it reminds us that hope is rarely sustained alone. Hope survives around shared tables. Hope survives around music and songs, even when the world is crashing. Hope survives with colors and celebrations in communities that refuse to let one another carry their burdens alone. But my fourth gift, connected to relation, takes the relationality to a cosmic level. For many peoples in Abya Yala, let's take our Quechua people, they have a concept that they call sumac causai. Sumac causai means good life. But good life is never meant to be understood as an individual. I cannot have a good life if my neighbor is hungry. I can never have a full life if I am affecting my neighbor in a way or another. However, sumac causai also includes the non-human creation. I cannot have a full life if the river is being polluted. I cannot have a good life if the trees are being cut. So for many peoples, the animals, the rivers, the mountains, the forests, the stars, our ancestors, but also the future generations are all part of a sort of cosmic living web. Imagine all of us connected through some strings that are part of a living web, but also the trees and the animals are also connected to that living web. If one element disappears, the whole web is affected. This is how we understand interdependence. Whatever happens in that web will affect me, even if it's not close. This is how we understand mutual care. This is how we understand interrelationship, interdependence, reciprocity as well. And Christianity actually has not always been very good at seeing creation as a neighbor. However, the scripture is full of images that challenge us. Creation praises God. The trees clap their hands, the mountains sing, the earth mourns, the whole creation groans in eager expectation of redemption. The non-human world is not a silent background, but actually is a participant in God's story, active participant. So perhaps the wisdom of indigenous communities invites us to see creation again, not as a resource to be consumed, but as a living community loved by God and to be loved by us. It invites us to rediscover our place within that community and to imagine salvation as restoration of relationships across the whole created order. So we need this renewed imagination that can lead us to renewed ways of living. And perhaps this is an invitation for us today to see differently, to relate differently, to believe differently, and in doing so, to bear witness to the God who is making all things new. So I want to conclude, and there are some beans in the back, and I have some beans here. If anyone wants to grab one. And I want to conclude going back to my chapter 1, to that shoreline, that first encounter, the moment where our story began. In the beginning of the story, we encounter a seed that was bound in chains. But today, we have the opportunity to live carrying a seed that is alive. This is not dead. This is life. And this is alive. And this is also free. It's a free seed. So for a moment, let's open the hand, all of us. Those who have seed, you can put your seed in the hand, or you can imagine that you have a seed in your hand. So try to simply hold that seed in your open hand. Opening the hand is an intentional movement. You see, the babies, they were not born like this. Like this seems to be like quite a natural movement. Opening the hand requires intentionality, especially when we want to really open the hand. An open hand cannot dominate. An open hand intentionally gives away control. An open hand is also exposed. It's vulnerable. We are presenting our fragile part of self. Opening the hand, however, is the only way in which we can give. And it's the only way in which we can also receive. And perhaps this is the type of the gospel witness that God needs today. Followers with open-handed attitudes, bringing transformation, but also willing to be transformed, willing to challenge the powers of empire, and to cling to the quiet, persistent power of a seed. It's a seed that survives. It's a seed that takes root. It's a seed that bears fruit beyond what anyone could have imagined. So my prayer for us today is that we may become open-handed people who carry seeds wherever God has put us to sow. Thank you so much.
So we have our seeds. I want to give us just 1 minute to go from here to here with all that we've heard. Take a moment. If you have a journal, write down your thought, write down your prayer. Take a moment of silence to process. And to help us continue processing, we have a response from Paul Coleman, who is our friend. He is a past president of ASM. He teaches over here across the street, he always says, at Notre Dame, focusing on mission history, African Christian history, and world Christianity. He's a Catholic priest of the Congregation of the Holy Cross. And he currently serves as executive vice president of ASM. So welcome, Paul Coleman.
As you might imagine, it was a very powerful experience to read Maria's paper a few weeks ago and to reread it in anticipation of seeing it underway today. It was even more powerful to see it with her own personality presenting it and the images she put together. So thank you so much. It's a privilege to respond to it, which is so clearly the fruit of faith-filled reflection on historical experience through a powerfully theological lens. Ruth helped locate my social location in the same way that Maria began by identifying hers. Being someone who's taken quite seriously the complexities of missionary evangelization and the complexity of its outcomes, I really appreciate the fact that Maria gave us a theologically profound image deep in the Christian tradition, that of a seed. I appreciate that she gave us an historical framework. And I appreciate that she condensed the image and the historical framework with an invitation for the gifts that the Latin American Christian experience has for the world. Each of those three parts seem to me to be very important, and I want to comment on each of them briefly. I do so, of course, also because one of the invitations we've invited ourselves to as a society is that each of the plenary sessions, if not given by a missiologist, would be responded to by a missiologist. So in some ways, that's one of the reasons I'm here. The seed. This is, of course, a deeply biblical image, and Jesus' parables pick up horticultural images from the Hebrew scriptures, especially the vineyard. But the parables of seeds among Jesus' existing spoken words are many. The parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the wheat and the tares. And we know that St. Paul used the similar images in describing his own mission. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. Mission history is replete with many examples of missionaries thinking of their work as planting seeds. And I appreciate very much that Maria foregrounded the kind of constraining realities of the seeds planting as happened in Latin America. The pot is the image that Arias gave 4 centuries after that initial planting to kind of describe it, and that seems to have been very fruitful for you. Now let's like to turn to the 4-stage framework a little bit. I appreciate very much the citing of the debates at Valladolid in the 16th century, which are historically significant for all sorts of reasons, not least because historians see them as a seedbed for the contemporary notion of human rights as an internationally accepted way to talk about international law. But of course, they were very much shaped by the particular experiences of missionaries and colonizers in Latin America and the suffering of Amerindian peoples, and later also of Africans forced and sent to Latin America and the other Americas, the rest of the Americas. The shifting then from 4 centuries of history was a lot for this Roman Catholic. As you might imagine. I, having been to Cusco and other places in Quito, and having seen the fruits of 4 centuries of Catholic evangelization, even if it was deeply flawed, which admittedly it was in many ways, suggests to me that the pot constraining the seed might not have been fully constraining. I think we can find examples of heroic Christian virtue in those 4 centuries as well. And thus, for a society like ours, which really values ecumenism, I want to make sure that that broader story is appreciated without simply being overlooked. And I don't think you would want to overlook it, but you're telling a story that's very personal too, and valuable. For instance, even the narratives of independence that most every Latin American country tells show independence-striving people using Christian narratives, and also show resistance to independence drawing on Christian narratives. Every country, both sides, use Christian narratives to defend Spanish or Portuguese ongoing rule and to defend independence, even if it was still partial. The early 19th century independence is certainly being partial in many ways. When I think about my colleague, one-time colleague Gustavo Gutierrez's second important book, We Drink from Our Own Wells, that is a theological way to talk using a metaphor of water, not seeds, to talk about the fact that those wells were rich, even though the constraints were real. And that there's a lot of lived faith to recover of a vitality in Christian living and reflection. Finally, to turn to the most, for me, the kind of most present and valuable and vital part of the talk, the conclusion about those 4 kind of fruits that the Latin American church presents to us. I do think there's a particular insight for Christian theology from a global perspective that Latin American theology provides in deep awareness of present circumstances shaping the life of faith. No place in the global Christian ecumen that I know of has taken that as seriously as the Latin American church, understood broadly. And I do think it's therefore not surprising that insights into coloniality have come so primarily from people who focus on Latin America, like Walter Mignolo and others. And I've found theological richness in what they've done. I appreciate that Latin America is also, along with many other places, a place where theology has taken seriously the embodiment of faith in bodies, in actual bodies, and that feminist theologians, I don't find that as much of a distinctive Latin American thing as the first. When I think of Abya Yala's citation of the crucified peoples and the fruitfulness of other theologians and philosophers, I do think Latin America has done something very distinctive in that regard. And in literature as well as philosophy and theology. Like Zubiri would be another person whose philosophy Abya Yala was deeply shaped by. I think also resisting through communities, that would be a very distinctive Latin American contribution to the global church, especially through the role of basic Christian communities on the Catholic side, but also among non-Catholic Christians, evangelicals and others. Finally, one of my early teachers in the study of religion was a guy named Larry Sullivan, one-time leader of the Center for World Christianity at Harvard, and originally a Latin Americanist who wrote a book kind of one of the first systematic efforts to understand the kind of deep religious ideals that united the peoples of Abya Yala. And that's an ongoing project since so much of the pre-contact world did disappear. But it seems to me that more and more we do have insights into that world from good scholars, because the seeds of God's Spirit, which may have even existed, which certainly did exist in Latin America prior to the encounter with Christ himself, those seeds also bore fruit in profound views of human flourishing that are worth treasuring. And Larry Sullivan's book kind of introduced me to that 40 years ago, and I was really grateful for it. So I just want to say thank you. You've made me think fruitfully with a biblical image. You've given me an historical framework that I think we all have, and they're always selective. They're always selective, right? And you've given us a lot to think about in terms of Latin American contributions to the contemporary theological undertaking and the missiological undertaking. So, thank you very much.